Hello, friends. Welcome back to our channel, where we bring forgotten moments of history back to life. Today, we journey into one of the greatest survival stories ever told, a tale of courage, leadership, and the human spirit's refusal to break, even when trapped in one of the most unforgiving places on Earth. This is the story of endurance and the man who led 27 others into the frozen heart of Antarctica, only to face a battle not against enemies, but against nature itself. It was November 1914. The world was at war, but far from the gunfire and trenches, a different kind of adventure was about to begin. Aboard a ship called Endurance, 28 men prepared to sail into the unknown. Their leader, Sir Ernest Shackleton, was one of the most daring explorers of his time. His dream was extraordinary, to be the first human to cross the entire continent of Antarctica, from one side to the other, on foot, to march across 3,000 kilometers of ice, snow, and blinding storms, through a place no man had ever survived for long. Imagine this moment. No GPS, no radio, no helicopters, no rescue plans, only wooden ships, fur-lined coats, and faith. Shackleton's team included sailors, scientists, carpenters, and even a photographer, Frank Hurley, whose images would one day capture history frozen in time. Each man aboard believed they were about to make history. They called themselves the Imperial Trans-Antarctic Expedition. Their mission? Reach the Weddell Sea, land near Weddell Bay, and begin the greatest overland trek in human history. Before heading into the ice, Endurance stopped at South Georgia Island, a lonely whaling outpost in the South Atlantic, the last place on Earth where civilization touched the edge of the unknown. Shackleton met local whalers who knew the southern seas better than anyone. Their warning was chilling. The ice this year is thicker than ever. Don't go. But Shackleton's eyes burned with purpose. He had come too far to turn back. History, he believed, belonged to the bold, and no obstacle could stop him now. By December 1914, the ship was deep within the Weddell Sea, a place sailors called the Ice Factory. The sea began to harden, trapping the ship between endless fields of floating ice. Still, Shackleton pressed on. The crew cut through frozen slabs, pushing the ship forward inch by inch, but nature had other plans. By January 1915, Endurance came to a standstill, frozen solid in the grip of the Antarctic. They had no idea that this was where their true journey would begin. At first, they believed it was temporary. The engines ran day and night, the crew used saws and poles to break the ice, but as days turned into weeks, the ice only thickened. The ship became a prisoner. The Weddell Sea was alive, it moved, it crushed, it destroyed. Shackleton realized they weren't just trapped, they were drifting, carried by the moving ice, away from their planned route, farther from land and deeper into the heart of Antarctica. Winter came early. Temperatures plummeted below -50 degrees Celsius. The sun disappeared for months, leaving behind an endless night of howling winds and frozen silence. Shackleton turned Endurance into a floating camp. The men built shelters on deck, made games out of their routines, and even held ice concerts to lift their spirits. But beneath the laughter, they all knew the truth. The ice was tightening its grip, squeezing the ship like a toy between the hands of a giant. Hurley's photographs captured haunting scenes, the Endurance surrounded by mountains of ice, her masts stretching helplessly towards a pale sky. The sound of creaking wood echoed like distant thunder. Shackleton's men wrote in their journals, "The ice groans like a living thing." They could feel the pressure building beneath their feet. Nature was speaking, and it was not kind. By October 1915, 9 long months after being trapped, the ship began to break. The ice crushed her hull, timbers cracked like gunfire, and water poured in faster than the pumps could handle. Shackleton made the hardest decision of his life. He gathered the men and said, "She's going down. Abandoned ship." They salvaged everything they could: tents, sledges, supplies, and even 3 lifeboats. Shackleton even threw away his gold coins and Bible pages to show his men that survival, not wealth, was what mattered now. Hurley, the photographer, was forced to destroy most of his glass negatives to reduce weight. He kept only 150, the images that would one day show the world what courage looked like on the edge of existence. That night, as Endurance creaked and moaned, Shackleton and his men watched in silence as their ship, their home, their hope, slowly disappeared beneath the ice. The Endurance was gone. The men were now alone, stranded on drifting ice, hundreds of miles from the nearest land. No radio, no maps, no rescue. Just the white emptiness of Antarctica stretching endlessly in all directions. But even in that moment of despair, Shackleton's voice broke the silence. He said, "We are not lost. We are alive, and that's our greatest fortune. As long as we live, hope lives." The men built a camp on the ice, calling it Ocean Camp. Shackleton's leadership became their anchor. He kept routines strict, meals on time, duties assigned, morale enforced. He knew that survival wasn't just about food or shelter, it was about faith. And so began a battle not for glory, but for life itself, against cold, hunger, and the vast, merciless power of nature.
As the wreck of Endurance disappeared beneath the ice, the men stood silently under the pale Antarctic sky. Their hearts were heavy, their faces burned by cold winds. They were now castaways on a continent that wanted them dead. There was no radio, no rescue ship, and no hope of anyone even knowing where they were. The nearest humans were hundreds of miles away, separated by seas of shifting ice and storms that could tear tents apart in seconds. But amid the despair, one thing kept the group together: Shackleton's unshakable calm. He refused to let panic take over. A man must shape his own destiny, he told them. We will get home, all of us. It wasn't a promise he could guarantee, but it was a spark of hope. And in a place as deadly as Antarctica, hope was fuel. Shackleton made sure his men stayed busy. Every task, no matter how small, gave them purpose. Some built shelters out of ice blocks. Others hunted seals and penguins for food. The dogs, loyal and brave, hauled sledges across the floes, though even they began to weaken in the endless cold. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. The frozen sea beneath them cracked and groaned like a living beast. Sometimes the ice beneath their camp would split open overnight, creating black chasms of icy water. Men would wake to the sound of splitting ice and scramble to move tents and supplies before the camp was swallowed whole. Each night, the sound of the ice breaking became a terrifying reminder. They were standing on something that could vanish at any moment. Shackleton's leadership was tested every single day. He kept spirits up with humor, music, and discipline. He'd gather everyone for meals, insisting they eat together no matter how grim things looked. He'd laugh with them, told stories, and treated everyone, from officers to sailors, as equals. He knew morale was as important as food. If despair took hold, the ice would claim them faster than hunger or cold. By now their supplies were running dangerously low. Seal meat and penguin fat kept them alive, but barely. The men's faces had grown gaunt, their clothes stiff with frost. Frostbite claimed fingers and toes, lips cracked and bled from the icy wind. Yet somehow they kept going, because Shackleton never allowed them to stop believing. Every night before sleep, he would walk among their tents, checking each man, offering a word of encouragement or a joke to lift their spirits. Leadership, he knew, meant more than giving orders. It meant giving hope. In December 1915, Shackleton realized the ice was slowly drifting north, taking them closer to open water. It was a small chance, but a chance nonetheless. He decided that when the ice began to break, they would launch the lifeboats and head for land. But until then, they had to wait, trapped between ice floes that shifted like puzzle pieces on a restless ocean. January turned to February. The endless white began to melt into a chaotic maze of slush and ice fragments. They could hear the roar of waves beneath their feet, a haunting reminder that the sea was waking up. Shackleton ordered preparations for departure. The men packed their gear and readied the lifeboats. They named them James Caird, Dudley Docker, and Stancomb Wills. 3 fragile wooden boats that would soon be their only hope of survival. In April 1916, after 15 months trapped in the Antarctic, the ice finally shattered around them. Shackleton gave the order, "Launch the lifeboats." The men hauled the lifeboats across splintering floes, crashing through freezing water and battling icy winds that cut like knives. It was chaos. Waves slammed into them, ice chunks collided, and freezing spray drenched their clothes until they turned to armor made of ice. For 7 brutal days and nights they rode through hell. Freezing temperatures, blizzards, exhaustion, and hunger. Many of them were barely conscious, their hands raw and blistered from rowing. Frostbite fingers could hardly grip the oars, but they kept rowing because Shackleton refused to stop. His voice, hoarse and firm, echoed over the wind. "Row, men! Land is close!" And then, after what felt like eternity, they saw it. A dark shape rising on the horizon. Elephant Island. It was nothing more than a rocky, frozen wasteland, but to the men it looked like paradise. It was land, solid ground, something that didn't move, crack, or threaten to swallow them alive. They stumbled ashore, starving, frostbitten, and too weak to speak. Some fell to their knees and kissed the ground. For the first time in nearly 500 days, they stood on firm land. Shackleton watched them silent, knowing that though they had reached land, their journey was far from over. Elephant Island was uninhabited, isolated, and far off any shipping route. No one in the world even knew they were alive. Still, they built a camp using overturned boats and scraps of canvas. They hunted seals and penguins again for food and fuel, melting snow for drinking water. Frank Wild, Shackleton's second in command, helped keep order, ensuring the men had routine and purpose. Each day they repaired clothing, tended to frostbite, and kept the fires alive with scraps of blubber. The smoke stung their eyes, but it meant warmth and life. Despite the exhaustion, the realization soon hit them. They couldn't stay here. Rescue would never come. Shackleton understood that their only hope was to reach civilization, to find help. The nearest whaling station was on South Georgia Island, more than 1,300 kilometers away, across the most violent stretch of ocean on Earth, the Drake Passage. It was a suicide mission, but Shackleton was willing to risk everything. He selected 5 men to accompany him: Frank Wild, Tom Crean, Timothy McCarthy, John Vincent, and Harry McNish. They would take the strongest of the lifeboats, the James Caird, and attempt the impossible: sail across the freezing, storm-torn seas in a 22-foot open boat guided only by a sextant and courage. Before leaving, Shackleton turned to Frank Wild and said, "Take care of the men and keep their hope alive. I shall come back." The men watched as Shackleton and his team pushed the James Caird into the freezing surf on April 24, 1916. The waves crashed over the little boat as they rowed into the unknown. Those left behind stood silently on the shore, watching until the small sail vanished into the horizon. The wind howled around them, but one sentence echoed in their hearts: Shackleton's promise, "I shall come back." On Elephant Island, Wild kept that promise alive. Every morning he woke the men and told them, "Pack your gear, boys, the boss may come today." And though days turned into weeks, weeks into months, they believed him. Because in a place like Antarctica, belief was the only thing that kept a man from dying inside.
The James Caird was barely more than a lifeboat, 22 feet long, wooden, and open to the elements. Shackleton and his 5 men knew this journey could kill them, but the thought of leaving their crew to die on Elephant Island was worse than death itself. They loaded the boat with food for just a few weeks, a small sail, and a compass. Frank Worsley, the ship's captain, would navigate using only the stars when the sky was clear enough to see them. Most days, it wasn't. The sea they faced, the Drake Passage, was the most violent on Earth. Waves rose as high as houses, winds screamed like banshees, and freezing spray coated the men in layers of ice. The cold was beyond anything human bodies were meant to endure. Sleep was impossible. The boat rocked and slammed with every wave. Salt water soaked their clothes and froze instantly, turning them into stiff armor. Their beards froze to their faces. Their fingers turned black with frostbite. They could barely eat, and when they did, it was frozen scraps of seal meat gnawed with shaking hands. For 16 days and nights, they fought for their lives. Storms nearly capsized them again and again. More than once, they bailed water for hours just to stay afloat. McCarthy collapsed from exhaustion. Vincent and McNish were nearly delirious from cold. Shackleton himself grew weak, his lips cracked, eyes red from salt and wind, but he refused to show fear. Every time hope began to fade, he'd shout above the wind, "Hold on, boys! South Georgia is near!" Frank Worsley, with frozen fingers, managed to take readings from his sextant whenever a rare break in the clouds appeared. Each calculation could mean life or death. One wrong reading, and they'd be lost forever. Miraculously, his navigation was near perfect. After 2 weeks of torture at sea, on May 10, 1916, Shackleton spotted land through the fog, South Georgia Island, the same island they had left nearly 2 years earlier. Against all odds, they had made it. But their ordeal was not over. The storm winds were too fierce to land safely. The little boat was tossed like a toy against cliffs and ice. They were forced to land on the wrong side of the island, the side no one lived on, separated from the whaling station by mountains of ice and rock. They had reached land, but civilization was still on the other side of hell. They built a small camp in a cave, eating penguin meat and melting snow for water. Shackleton realized the James Caird couldn't go any farther. The only way to reach help was to cross the island on foot. No one had ever done it before. The interior was unmapped, a deadly maze of glaciers and peaks. But Shackleton was determined. He chose Worsley and Tom Crean to go with him. They carried only a rope, a small axe, and a few biscuits each. No sleeping bags, no tents, no maps, just courage and instinct. At dawn on May 19, 1916, they began their climb. The wind screamed, snow blinded them, and the ice cracked under their boots. They marched for 36 straight hours without rest, terrified that if they stopped, they'd freeze to death in minutes. They slid down icy slopes on their bellies, crossed crevasses that could swallow a man whole, and climbed peaks higher than anything they'd ever faced. At one point, Shackleton thought he heard a fourth set of footsteps, though there were only 3 men. He later wrote that he believed an unseen presence had walked with them, something beyond explanation. Perhaps it was faith, perhaps fate, but it gave them strength. Finally, as dawn broke through the fog, they heard a sound, faint but real, a whistle. Shackleton froze. It was the whistle of a ship. They had reached the whaling station. The men stumbled down the slope, covered in ice and dirt, faces unrecognizable after 522 days at sea. When the whalers saw them, they were stunned. Shackleton, barely able to speak, asked one question. "Do you know me?" The man stared at him for a moment and said softly, "My God, it's Shackleton." After nearly 2 years, Shackleton was back among the living. But his thoughts were not of safety or rest. They were of the 22 men still waiting on Elephant Island. Within hours, he began organizing a rescue mission. The first ship they sent was stopped by ice. The second also failed. Months passed. Shackleton grew restless and refused to give up. Finally, in August 1916, with the help of the Chilean government, he secured a small vessel, the Yelcho. He sailed back into the frozen south through fog and storms, his heart pounding with every mile. When they finally neared Elephant Island, Shackleton stood at the bow, searching the horizon through binoculars. At first, there was nothing but mist. Then, movement, figures running on the shore. He raised his glass again. Yes, they were there. All of them. Every single one of the 28 men alive. As the Yelcho approached the beach, the men of Elephant Island erupted in cheers. Frank Wilde and the others rushed forward, waving frantically, tears freezing on their faces. Shackleton stepped on the shore, eyes wet, unable to speak. He looked at his men, thinner, older, changed forever, and asked only one question. "Are you all well?" Frank Wilde replied, "All safe, boss. All well." Not a single life had been lost.
After more than 2 years since they first set sail from England, Shackleton brought every one of his men home. They had survived shipwreck, starvation, freezing temperatures, and the merciless wild of Antarctica, not because they were the strongest, but because they never stopped believing in each other. Shackleton had led them not through success, but through survival, and that, in the end, was the greater victory. Years later, Shackleton would return to the Antarctic once more. In 1922, he set out on another expedition, but this time, his heart gave out before he could begin. He died aboard his ship, Quest, off South Georgia Island, the very place that had saved him years earlier. He was buried there at Grytviken, surrounded by the icy seas that had defined his life. His men called him the Boss, and they never forgot what he had done for them. More than a century later, in 2022, explorers found the wreck of Endurance, resting nearly 10,000 feet below the Weddell Sea, perfectly preserved in the freezing darkness. Her name still visible across the stern, untouched by time. It was as if the ice itself had kept her safe, a tribute to the courage and spirit of the men who refused to surrender. The story of Shackleton and Endurance is more than a tale of exploration. It's a lesson in leadership, unity, and the power of hope. Shackleton didn't conquer Antarctica, he conquered despair. He proved that even in the darkest, coldest, most hopeless moments, the human spirit can endure. So the next time life feels impossible, remember this. 28 men faced the endless ice, starvation, and death, and not one of them gave up. Sometimes the greatest victories don't come from reaching the goal, but from refusing to stop walking towards it. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel for more real stories of courage, mystery, and survival. Thank you for watching, and remember, the true measure of strength is not how far you go, but how long you hold on when the world turns to ice around you.